So we've been learning about the conflicts between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, particularly Alexander Hamilton, who was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican. However, there's a lot that they agreed on, particularly foreign policy. Despite the fact that issues like the National Bank were extremely controversial between the two major parties at the time, there was an agreement that neutrality was really the best way to move forward in foreign policy. So the major goals of our first 5 presidents: neutrality. This is giving support to neither side in a foreign war or even in just economic competition, which often leads to war. Maintain the U.S. as a sovereign republic, and support Latin American independence movements. This all began with President Washington's farewell address, and he issued a proclamation of neutrality partway through his presidency and reiterated how important it was to remain neutral in his farewell address. So why is it such an important goal? Britain controls Canada to the north of the United States, and Spain controls Florida and the Mississippi to the south and to the west. Both of these nations have extremely strong navies that can navigate the Atlantic coast quite well. So they're surrounded on 3 sides by land and can be easily attacked by water on their 4th side. So the conclusion is you don't want to make any enemies by choosing sides in any kind of conflict, because you're probably, as a young nation, not strong enough to resist attacks. Maintaining neutrality and not making enemies falls right into place with the sovereignty of the U.S. Republic, which was the second stated goal from the previous slide. If you don't make enemies and no one attacks you, you will have a much easier time remaining sovereign. So some examples of neutrality. During Washington's presidency, the French Revolution exploded in Europe, and the French revolutionaries fighting for democracy against their monarchy asked for U.S. aid. And Washington said no because of his policy of neutrality. The French were not very happy about this, because the French had given the United States aid during our revolution and felt as though we owed it to their revolutionaries to give them aid. However, Washington stuck to his guns and said no, because we have a very firm policy of neutrality. John Adams, who was Washington's vice president and became the second president of the United States, had an issue of U.S. ships on the high seas being seized by, at this time, namely France, and demanding bribes in order to return those ships. Adams was being pushed by the public not to pay the bribes, not to fall into the trap. A quote is, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," which simply means bribery. The French diplomats who demanded the bribes in one specific instance were identified only as X, Y, and Z, so that they would remain anonymous. So the incident becomes known as the XYZ affair. France demanding bribes from the U.S. government to return U.S. ships that had been seized. Once Napoleon took power after the revolution, Adams reached a settlement with him to end the conflict. So the XYZ affair was able to be settled peacefully with no fighting. During the Napoleonic Wars, Thomas Jefferson had Britain and France stopping American cargo ships. They stole cargo. Sometimes they even forced U.S. sailors to serve in the British Navy, which is known as impressment. Rather than declare war, Jefferson declared an embargo on all U.S. goods to Europe, which meant we would refuse to trade with Europe. It was meant to hurt the European economy, but all it really did was hurt American merchants, and so the embargo was lifted after 2 years. The impressment continued, and under the presidency of James Madison, it eventually led to the War of 1812. So Jefferson really didn't do a great job of handling the impressment issue. Madison also wanted to avoid war, but there was way too much pressure among the U.S. public for war with Britain as a result of these impressment issues. So James Madison eventually ends up having to go to war. Why did the War of 1812 even happen? You have the impressment on the high seas. We've already discussed this. It's a persistent problem that Jefferson had also dealt with, not very effectively, or Madison wouldn't have been dealing with it. Second, settlers of the West were complaining of Native American attacks. This is where Tecumseh becomes famous, and the major complaint was that the British were supplying the Native Americans that were attacking these settlements with the weapons that they were using. And lastly, war hawks in Congress thought that if they fought a war with Britain, they might have a good opportunity to acquire portions, if not all, of British Canada. So war was officially declared in 1812, hence the name. The early stages of the war did not go well for the United States at all. The U.S. attempted to invade Canada, and that miserably failed. And also, the British captured and burned Washington, D.C. There's famous stories of James Madison's wife, Dolly, saving a portrait of George Washington and taking it with her as she escaped the burning White House. Eventually, the U.S. does overcome the early defeats. They win a major naval victory on Lake Erie in 1813, and Andrew Jackson leads troops to a major victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, which ironically enough was fought after the signing of a formal peace settlement between the U.S. and Britain. But the news did not reach New Orleans to either side by the time the battle was underway. But the Battle of New Orleans was a distinctive victory for the United States. The peace settlement at the end of the war was really a draw. Neither side gained money, neither side gained any territory, and so there's mixed reactions to this within the United States. Some people wanted us to keep fighting Britain and get the upper hand and demand something in a settlement. Others were more than happy to get out of the war. Nationalism. There's no benefit to either side, but Americans took pride in fighting off the British to a draw. We had defeated them in the American Revolution, and here we were defeating them again. Andrew Jackson becomes a national hero. He is eventually elected president. And Francis Scott Key writes the Star-Spangled Banner, which is adopted as the national anthem. So nationalism is on the rise as a result of the War of 1812. There were Americans that were not excited about fighting the war, however. There were a delegation of Federalists from the New England states that protested the war and even threatened to secede from the Union. During the winter of 1814 to 1815, they held the Hartford Convention in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss secession. Here are some famous images of the Battle of New Orleans. You can see here the heavily defended U.S. line and the British troops on this side that attacked and suffered catastrophic losses. There are various paintings that are famous from the War of 1812. On the bottom right here, you see Andrew Jackson, who this is most definitely dramatized, would not be standing on the top of the defenses like this, or he would most definitely have been shot. However, he becomes famous as a result of this resounding victory. After the war, the Federalists had been absolutely embarrassed by the fact that they had held the Hartford Convention and threatened secession over the War of 1812. The Democratic Republicans dominated the election of 1816. James Monroe was unanimously reelected in 1820. There is a period of Monroe's presidency that is known as the era of good feelings because there's really common sentiments throughout the whole country. Everyone is pretty much on the same page. There's not a lot of disagreement going on in this time period. What James Monroe is most known for is the issuing of the Monroe Doctrine. One of the goals stated at the beginning of this presentation was to support Latin American independence movements against their European mother countries. Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, were worried that European powers may try to come back and reconquer their colonies. And as a warning to particularly Spain and Portugal, Monroe sent a message to Congress that was later known as the Monroe Doctrine. This was in 1823. What the document said was that the Western Hemisphere is now off limits to any further European colonization. The U.S. would firmly oppose any European power that intervened in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and they are particularly focusing on Latin America here. It also went on to say that the U.S. would not involve itself in European affairs, which essentially was continuing the policy of neutrality in a more official capacity. Stay out of our side of the world, and we will stay out of yours. That is the message the Monroe Doctrine sends. Two major conflicts contributed to the end of the era of good feelings. One was the Missouri Compromise. Would new states be allowing or outlawing slavery? This is a major debate, and there were many threats of secession and eventually civil war. What the Missouri Compromise did to maintain the balance of power in the Senate so that slave states and free states had the same number of representatives in the Senate was they allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state. You can see that here. They allowed Maine to break away from being a part of Massachusetts and become its own state. You can see that there. It was a free state to maintain the balance of power in the Senate. And then this 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude line was said to be the separator between slave and free territory, so that any of those territories later becoming states would already be predetermined whether they could allow slavery or not. The second major issue that led to the end of the era of good feelings was the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson was hands down the favorite candidate of the people and hands down had the most electoral votes. However, this number of 99 was not an electoral majority. So the election goes to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams was chosen by the House of Representatives as the next president. Immediately, Andrew Jackson accuses the House of Representatives of some kind of corrupt bargain to allow Adams to be the president. He campaigned hard, and in the election of 1828, resoundingly defeated Adams in his bid for re-election and became the president in 1828. But it's these two events, the Missouri Compromise and the election of 1824, that leads the United States to being very divided again after a period of time when everyone had been on the same page for the most part. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go to the website and take the online quiz. Use your notes so that you can do very well. And I will see you in class. Thank you.